What if the oldest story ever told was never written down? No books, no ruins, no towering statues. Just whispers in the wind, carved into caves, carried in the blood. For decades, they were footnotes, sketches in anthropological journals. Nomadic tribes, they said. Isolated. Primitive. But here's the contradiction that rattles the entire timeline of humanity. The world's longest surviving culture, barely mentioned in the story of civilization. Australian Aboriginals, the name we gave them. But their real history? It doesn't start in 1788. It begins 65,000 years ago, before the pyramids, before the Ice Age, before anyone else dared cross the sea. While Europe was still a frozen wilderness, their ancestors were already navigating ancient oceans. Not in myth, in provable, physical, ancient DNA. Crossing through Southeast Asia, through the tangled islands of Wallacea, guided by memory, stars, and something deeper. They reached a forgotten supercontinent, Sahul. Today, we call it Australia and New Guinea. Back then, it was one vast canvas. And they didn't just arrive, they flourished. Within 2 millennia, they spread across the coasts, leaving stone tools, ochre pigments, and ancestral memory buried beneath desert sands. But here's the twist that flipped everything we thought we knew about human migration. For years, textbooks claimed 2 great waves out of Africa. One to the north, through the Levant. One to the east, later, much later. But the genome said otherwise. When researchers sequenced an Aboriginal hair sample, just 100 years old, what they found rewrote the map. Aboriginal ancestors didn't come later. They branched off first. Before Europeans, before East Asians, they were already moving south, already forming a separate thread in the human tapestry. A southern route. An exodus so early, so successful, it left a ghost trail in the DNA, but barely a whisper in our history books. So why? Why is the oldest surviving lineage on Earth absent from the story we tell ourselves? Why do we know the myths of Rome and Egypt, but not the voices of people who outlived them all? If they came first, where did they go in our history? There was a time, not long after humanity took its first steps out of Africa, when a continent rose where none exists today. It wasn't called Australia. Not yet. It wasn't New Guinea either. It was Sahul, a vast, green-brown heartbeat stitched together by low seas and ancient silence. A supercontinent untouched, waiting. And then they came. Not by force, not in conquest, but with courage, with memory, with blood that still echoes in the veins of their descendants. No one knows their names, but they crossed waters no one had crossed before. In canoes carved from myth, using stars not just for direction, but for home. They landed on shores no human had seen, and within mere lifetimes, they were everywhere. From the northern tropics to the southern deserts, from craggy cliffs to winding riverbeds, families settled. Children were born. Languages began to breathe. Ochre was ground into pigment. Stories were pressed into the walls of caves. And then, something almost impossible happened. They stayed. For 50,000 years, they stayed. No empire rose. No conquest scattered them. No cold age drove them out. Across vast deserts and coasts, they adapted, not by changing the land, but by becoming part of it. Their genetics didn't spread out like a flood. They rooted down. Each group, tied to their country, held by songs, spirit, and soil. Majbeeb, a quiet place now, holds their memory. Stone tools left by hands that knew fire before Europe knew farming. Grinding stones worn smooth by the same lineages that would one day speak in dreamtime. And in that stillness, in that rootedness, lies a paradox, because while the people stayed, the land did not. The oceans rose. The lowlands drowned. The supercontinent split, quietly, violently. Sahul was torn in two. Australia pulled west, New Guinea east, like siblings separated in sleep. But the land would not stay whole, and neither would its people. They say the ocean separated them, that it rose like a wall, drowning the land, carving 2 nations from one, Australia and New Guinea, and leaving cousins marooned on different shores. But the truth is stranger than sea, because long before the waves came, before the flood, before Sahul was torn apart, the split had already begun. Not in war, not in memory, but in blood. 47,000 years ago, when the land bridge still held firm, when you could walk from Arnhem Land to the highlands of Papua, something invisible happened. Two branches, once entwined, began to drift. Quietly, irreversibly. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the ancestors of Papuans started to become strangers. No fences, no fights, just time and silence. It's as if two siblings shared a home, but started speaking in different dreams. One stayed close to the deserts, the red stone, the whispering country. The other wandered deeper into the jungle mist, among high mountains and rain-laced skies. They still saw each other. Traded maybe. Called across the plains. But inside, their genes were already rewriting the script. Line by line. Mutation by mutation. Each step taken apart was a page torn out of a shared story, and written into two. The land bridge held for millennia. But connection didn't. And then, as if sealing a fate that had already played out, the seas rose. What was once one world became two. Shorelines swallowed. Paths forgotten. Songs silenced by the tide. Yet their bones still carry echoes of the other. A shared origin etched deep, beneath the differences, beneath the centuries, like a heartbeat felt in a ghost limb. But the genome held more than just lost kinship. Buried beneath their divergence was something no human could explain. A trace not from each other, not from any known people, but from something older, something ancient, something not human. There are shadows in the blood, relics of lives we never knew, and faces we've never seen. For centuries, we believed we were alone, that Homo sapiens walked out of Africa and into an empty world, clean, unshared. But then came the genomes, and they told a different story. Aboriginal Australians, among the oldest continuous human populations on Earth, carry something no one expected. Not just the memory of their ancestors, but the DNA of another kind of human. Denisovans, a species we barely understand, known only from a sliver of bone in a Siberian cave, a molar in Tibet, and now fragments in the blood of people who never left the tropics. In Aboriginal genomes, they make up 4, sometimes 6%. That's higher than anywhere else on Earth. Higher than Papuans. Higher than Southeast Asians. Higher than any people who were ever supposed to meet them. And it didn't happen once. Not in one lonely cave, or a fleeting encounter. The data suggests 2 Denisovan populations, not one. 2 different branches. 2 separate meetings. Ghosts within ghosts. Somewhere along the dark rainforests of island Southeast Asia, modern humans met their ancient cousins. They didn't war. They didn't run. They interwove. Shared fire. Shared breath. Shared children. And when our ancestors moved on, across the seas, into Sahul, they carried those bloodlines with them. What does it mean to have the DNA of another human species inside you? Is it just science, or something deeper? Did the old stories, the ones whispered under stars and sung around fires, remember these others? The beings with strange eyes, with long arms, who came from the hills and vanished into smoke. Are they the ones in the dreaming? The spirit people? The watchers? Because the genome remembers what we forget. And yet, even this wasn't the deepest mystery their DNA held. There's a riddle buried in the bones of northern Australia, and it begins with a whisper from across the sea. Around 4,000 years ago, someone arrived. Not in fleets, not in conquest, but they came from India, it seems, across the water, carrying more than just their footsteps. They brought change. The dingo appeared suddenly, a creature with no native ancestor on the continent. Alongside it, new microlith tools spread across the north. Sharper, faster, unmistakably foreign. And then the genome blinked. In some Aboriginal groups, fragments, faint, like fingerprints in ash, show up in the DNA. 11%. A whisper of ancestry. Here, then gone. But here's the twist. These people, whoever they were, left no names, no graves, no empires, no great lineage that echoes through time. Just tools, dogs, a few genes, and then silence. What kind of people alter a civilization, only to disappear? The old stories don't name them. The land doesn't remember their faces. And the blood, even the blood, only holds a trace. as if they walked into the continent, rewrote a chapter, and faded into the dirt. But they didn't come alone. Around the same time, something else began to move, not with ships or spears, but with words. A language, or perhaps many, began to ripple outward from the northeast. It didn't travel with armies. It traveled like a spell, like a breath caught on the wind, and in a matter of centuries, it reached nearly every corner of the continent. What force carries a language thousands of miles, without a migration? The ones who brought it are gone, but the tongue remains, and their disappearance wasn't the only thing unexplained. A linguistic revolution had just begun. It began in the northeast, with no empire, no war, no conquest. And yet within a few thousand years, almost the entire continent spoke its echo. Pama Nyungan, a language family so vast, it spans deserts, coastlines, mountains, more than 90% of Australia. One tongue, or its daughters, spoken by tribes who never met, who shared no blood, no trade routes, sometimes not even the same tools. This wasn't migration. This wasn't domination. This was something stranger. No bones show a flood of new people. No genome reveals a sweeping takeover. The DNA stays still, rooted, local, untouched. And yet the words moved. From the northeast, they flowed like water through stone, reshaping tongues, stitching together distant peoples through phrases, metaphors, stories that seemed to belong to no one, and yet lived in everyone. Imagine a whisper, passed hand to hand, fire to fire, never forced, never imposed, until it became the voice of a continent. It didn't replace bloodlines. It wove across them. Language as a ghost. Language as breath. Somewhere in the red heart of Australia, a boy would speak a word that mirrored one uttered 1,000 kilometers away, by someone who hunted different animals, danced different songs, buried their dead in a different sky. And yet they understood each other. Not because of kinship, because of culture, not because of conquest, because of connection. This wasn't a language spread by warriors. It was carried by memory, by stories, carried farther than footsteps. But how does a language move without its people? Why does the genome remain still, while the words dance across the map? And underneath this quiet revolution, the DNA told another story. It started with a strand of hair, collected over a century ago, tucked into an envelope, stored in silence. No one knew it held a map, not of trade routes, not of kingdoms, but of time. When scientists opened that envelope and sequenced the genome inside, they weren't just unlocking identity. They were unlocking history, because what that hair revealed was a lineage so deep, so rooted, it shattered everything we thought we knew about human migration. One sample from one Aboriginal man in the early 1900s carried the echo of a journey 50,000 years long, a journey that began in Africa, split from all other Eurasians, and never turned back. But that was only the beginning. In 2016, researchers expanded the scope. More than 80 Aboriginal Australians, across vast regions, offered their DNA. Not modern mixtures, ancestral codes. Pure, uninterrupted. And what they found was extraordinary. Every region told its own story. The Tiwi Islands, the Western Desert, Arnhem Land. Each group's DNA was distinct, and yet unchanged for tens of thousands of years. No other place on Earth showed this kind of stability. No other people had stayed so deeply tied to their land for so long. It was as if the genome had memorized the earth beneath their feet and refused to forget. Hair became more than hair. It became scripture. Every strand a scroll. Every twist of keratin, a line of ancient poetry, coiled around the double helix. It was the first time Western science truly began to understand what Aboriginal people had always said. This land isn't where they live, it's who they are. But what if the genome could say more? What if buried within these codes was more than memory? What if hidden inside that same genetic thread, the one they used to trace migrations, was something urgent, something modern, something medical? Because in 2023, a deeper truth emerged and it changed medicine forever. It wasn't a rare disease. It wasn't a mutation. It wasn't even dangerous. But the hospital said it was, because their database had never seen DNA like hers before. In 2023, scientists sequenced the genomes of over 150 Aboriginal Australians, remote communities, diverse languages, untouched histories. What they uncovered was staggering. 1 in 4 genetic variants had never been documented. Not in any global database. Not in NAM-AD. Not in 1,000 genomes. Not even in the massive archives used to design drugs, make diagnoses, or predict disease. A quarter of the Aboriginal genome was invisible to medicine. And what happens when the system can't see you? It labels your normal as broken. A child with a heart gene flagged as pathogenic. A grandmother told her glucose levels were a mystery. A boy denied treatment because his DNA didn't match the reference model built on European bodies. The database wasn't neutral. It was biased. And that bias had a body count. This wasn't about ancestry. This was about survival. Because when the code that keeps you alive is misunderstood, every misread can become a misdiagnosis. Imagine being told you're sick when you're not. Or worse, being sick and no one knows how to help you. Aboriginal genomes didn't just carry history. They carried answers. Unique variants. Protective adaptations. Secrets forged over tens of thousands of years in desert heat, monsoon rains, coastal winds. But none of it mattered because the system wasn't built for them. Not the tools. Not the testing. Not the trust. For too long, medicine saw Aboriginal people as a footnote or a risk, never as a foundation. So the question wasn't just how to fix the science. It was how to fix the relationship. Because to reclaim health, they first had to reclaim trust. It happened in a schoolyard. Not a clinic. Not a lab. A schoolyard. Children, Aboriginal children, lined up after class, unaware, unconsenting. Their blood taken. No explanation. No return. Just tubes. Shipped off. Archived. Forgotten. For decades, those samples sat in silence. Relics of a time when science didn't ask. It took. Not for their benefit. For research. For reports. For curiosity. No permission. No context. No trust. This was the wound. Not just the extraction, but the erasure. Of voice. Of agency. Of humanity. And yet, years later, when genomic science returned, knocking on community doors, the answer wasn't anger. It was a question. Who gets to tell our story? That's where the healing began. 8 years. That's how long NCIG spent. Not collecting data, but rebuilding trust. Community to community. Face to face. Cup of tea to cup of tea. They didn't start with sequencing. They started with listening. With elders. With mothers who remembered that schoolyard. With sons who'd grown up never knowing what was taken from them. This wasn't about filling databases. This was about sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty, a radical shift. Where research doesn't happen on Aboriginal people, but with them. For them. Led by them. And the difference is everything. Because now, when genomes are sequenced, they stay connected to country. When blood is drawn, the community owns the narrative. And the stories that emerge are shared stories. Not subjects. Not samples. Partners. In every sequence, the name. In every result, a relationship. It's not just ethical science. It's living science. And with that power, they began telling their own story again. It's not written in ink. Not carved in stone. Not stored in books. It's older than all that. You see it in cave walls, streaked with ochre. Handprints pressed like signatures across time. You hear it in songlines, mapped into memory, winding through desert and forest, river and flame. You feel it. In the silence of a sunrise over sacred ground, where the ancestors still walk, just beyond the veil. And now, you can read it in the genome. A double helix, coiled like a shell, like a serpent, whispering 65,000 years of unbroken story. The oldest living culture on Earth never left. They didn't migrate. They didn't vanish. They remained, through drought, through flood, through colonization and erasure. Because culture wasn't just passed down. It was embedded. In ritual. In language. In kinship. In DNA. The genome doesn't lie. It shows a people who crossed oceans before maps. Who held connection to countries so fiercely. Their blood adapted to the land. And the land to them. It reveals a continent shaped not by monuments, but by memory. It reveals time, not as a line, but as a circle. A grandmother's gene, found again in a great-granddaughter's breath. A cave painting echoed in a modern genome sequence. The same colors, the same shapes, the same song, sung in spirit and now in science. This isn't just history. It's identity. It's continuity. It's proof, molecular, spiritual, that culture can be carried through catastrophe and still rise, still speak. And if this is what one study revealed, imagine what stories are still waiting in our DNA. Subscribe for more untold stories from the human genome.